Hey guys, how are we doing? So we're back on another Swagkage video. It's been a while, and it seems like it's going to be a little bit different. It's not Naruto related. I'm intrigued. It's YuGiOh related, which is also cool because I like doing YuGiOh related videos on the channel. When it comes to the reactions, I did see Vits is everything wrong with YuGiOh season 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and he'd always mention like differences between the cards in real life and what they did in the anime. I always thought that was interesting and strange that they always did stuff like that. And I think it's cool that Swagkage has done a whole video which is just why that is. So why are Yu-Gi-Oh's rules different in real life?
Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. So something that comes up pretty frequently when people are talking about Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just how different the actual real-life card game is from Duel Monsters, the game we see people playing in the anime. It has to be to make now, this isn't necessarily dramatic the case with any later Yu-Gi-Oh! Series. Everything from GX onward, particularly Arc 5 and Brains, is pretty good about following the game's That's cool. The same can't be said for the original series, though, and this is especially true when talking about Duelist Kingdom. This arc's pretty infamous for all of the wacky nonsense that goes on throughout it. Some people even like to say that the game has no rules at this point in the series, and it can totally feel that way from time to time. If you've ever played the real game before, then it should be pretty easy for you to tell how its anime counterpart is different whenever you sit down to watch an episode. A lot of the differences between the two versions of the game are really apparent, but what isn't quite as obvious is why these differences exist in the first place. The most important reason for this is that the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga was not always about Duel Monsters. The manga had the characters playing all sorts of different games. There were video games, board games, tabletop RPGs, and then, of course, eventually, we got a chapter dedicated to a card game. This trading card game would eventually go on to become Duel Monsters, but that's not what it was at first. There are some noticeable similarities here for sure, but in many ways, this game is almost completely different. As a matter of fact, it's not even called Duel Monsters, at least not in the early chapters of the Japanese Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga. There, it's referred to as Magic and Wizards. If you pick up a Viz copy of any of these chapters, you'll see it's still called Duel Monsters, but even the translators seem to know that it was different enough to warrant some distinction, so instead of Magic and Wizards, in English it's just called First Edition Duel Monsters. Now, I was saying earlier, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was not always about Duel Monsters, and Takahashi has even said himself that he didn't plan on having the card game stick around for nearly as long as it did. Just like all of the other games the characters had played, it was meant to be the focus of a single self-contained story, but outside of this one appearance, that was it. So, bearing this in mind, it's pretty easy to infer that Takahashi didn't put that much thought into the rules and mechanics of the game.
Of course, because it was just meant to be a one-off thing.
For something that was only meant to appear in a few chapters, there is a surprising amount of depth to the game, but I don't think he ever expected it to become a real trading card game.
Phenomenon.
So it's pretty simple compared to what it would later become.
It's incredible what it is now.
As it turns out, people ended up really liking Duel Monsters. The reception to the game was so positive that it was made the focus of the entire series. The thing is, if you read the chapters where it made its first appearance, you can tell it definitely wasn't designed with something like this in mind. The game was too simple, it was horribly unbalanced, and it was obviously a parody of Magic the Gathering. For it to be the backbone of a 26-volume story, all of these things were going to have to change. Now, in retrospect, the issue with this is that the initial version of the game was very different from modern Duel Monsters, and not in the sense that it lacked modern summoning mechanics like Synchro Summoning and XZ Summoning, but in the sense that a lot of the game's core fundamental components were either very, very different from what they are today, or they just didn't exist. For example, First Edition Duel Monsters didn't have trap cards. The only card types in the game were magic cards and monster cards. There was also no such thing as an effect monster in this version of the game. The only cards with any effect at all were magic cards. Now, many of the other changes are still present in the Duelist Kingdom arc. The most obvious ones are, of course, that players start with 2,000 life points instead of 8,000, and that a monster's level had little to no impact on the game at all. There was no rule specifying that a player had to tribute one or more monsters to summon a monster that was level 5 or higher, and there certainly weren't any mechanics like Synchro Summoning or XZ Summoning that made levels an integral part of the game. In my opinion, though, the most major difference is the inclusion of non-effect-based interactions between certain cards. When I say this, I'm talking about stuff like Giant Soldier of Stone destroying the
I like that he's able to do the same format that he would normally do his Naruto stuff with the manga panels.
Like that. Now, each one of these things changes the game's substantially on its own, but all at once they make Duel Monsters feel completely different, and not in a good way. If you look at Yugi and Kaiba's first duel in the manga, then I think you'll agree with me that at this point the game is little more than a contest of numbers. It really just boils down to both Yugi and Kaiba trying to summon monsters with higher attack points than one another. Only 2 spell cards are activated throughout the entire game, and one of them is used to increase the attack points of one of Kaiba's monsters. As a matter of fact, this is also the case in their second match, which is the game we see played in the first episode of the anime. Now let's take a look at each of these differences, how they impacted the game, and come to a conclusion with regards to why they needed to be changed. I'll start with the lack of tribute summoning because I think it's the most obvious issue that early Duel Monsters had. Now this is more of a problem because of other things that are different about the game, particularly the lack of trap cards and the fact that players only started with 2,000 life points. But in general, it's just a huge balance problem. Based on the first 2 duels between Yugi and Kaiba, a player has no reason to play a monster with lower attack points over a monster with higher attack points. It's just that simple. Now I will say that this difference gives the early manga chapters a pretty cool novelty factor because of the levels that certain monsters are given. Ryukishin, a monster with only 1,000 attack points, is a level 5 monster, and Blackland Fire Dragon and Battle Ox are both level 6 monsters. Gaia the Fierce Knight was also a level 6 monster, and it just boggles my mind that Gaia the Fierce Knight and Battle Ox were the same level at one point. Anyway, the lack of tribute summoning also posed certain other issues for the game from a design standpoint. In early Duel Monsters, cards like Raigeki, Fissure, Dark Hole, they just could not exist because both players started with only 2,000 life points and trap cards were not a part of the game. So if your opponent were to go second, then activate one of these cards and summon any monster with 2,000 or more attack points, they would instantly win the game. And summoning a monster capable of killing your opponent in one attack is a really easy thing to do. It happens a lot just in Yugi and Kaiba's first 2 matches against each other. Now the issue with this is that without cards like Raigeki, Dark Hole, and Fissure, cards like Blue Eyes White Dragon are way too strong. It is pretty much impossible to get them off of the field once they are summoned, and you don't have to go through any setup or jump through any hoops to get them onto the field. So adding tribute summoning to the game and making it so that in order for you to summon a monster with like 50 trillion attack, you would have to tribute one or more of your own monsters, I think that was a really good idea, and it fixed a lot of potential issues with the game. Now, of course, the lack of tribute summoning was not the only issue with early Duel Monsters. We actually see an example of this sort of thing in Yugi's duel against Pandora, who's known as Arcana in the English dub of the anime. If the starting life points for both players had been kept the same in Battle City duels, then Yugi would have won this duel on his second turn. There are also multiple examples of players getting monsters onto the field with more than 2,000 attack points without having to tribute summon or even special summon them. This happens once each in the first 2 duels between Yugi and Kaiba. The first time it is because Kaiba activates a spell card called Giant's Might to increase the attack points of his Battle Ox from 1,700 to 2,040. And in their second match, again the duel we see in episode 1 of the anime, Kaiba activates a spell called Dark Energy, which triples the attack of any Fiend-type monster it's equipped to. Now he equips it to Sagi the Dark Clown, a monster with only 600 attack points, but he plays a Fiend-type monster with 1,000 attack points in his deck. And so even with Battle City rules, at least assuming the game still didn't have trap cards at this point, if Kaiba opened a combination of Raigeki, Dark Hole, or Fissure, and any of the other 2-card combos I already mentioned, he'd still be able to kill his opponent immediately. So to stop this from happening, I think Takahashi first introduced trap cards to the game to give players a way of interacting with their opponent even when it wasn't their turn, and later increased the amount of life points that players start with from 2,000 to 4,000. Now where things get really wacky is with those non-effect based interactions that I mentioned earlier. These things are all over the place and they make the game really confusing. The first example of this that I can find is in the second duel between Yugi and Kaiba. There's a point where Winged Dragon, Guardian of the Fortress, does battle with another monster that has the same number of attack points as it does, but Yugi mentions that because it has wings and can fly, there's a 35% chance that it will dodge incoming attacks, and that's exactly what happens next. Even though it and the monster it's battling have the same number of attack points, it doesn't get destroyed, but Kaiba's monster does. Now Takahashi has said in the past that he really likes tabletop role-playing games. They're his favorite kind of game, and so I imagine that stuff like this was him attempting to make Duel Monsters feel more like a tabletop RPG. Of course, the issue is this sort of thing only works if the game is automated, like Hearthstone, for example. 35% is a very specific number, and I don't know how you would just, like, offhand be able to figure out whether or not an attack against a monster like this would successfully land. Now, because the game is automated by the tech that Kaiba uses to produce holograms of all the monsters and spells. This isn't a problem in the series, but in real life, something like this just can't be a part
Yeah, you can't do that.
And like I said, these sorts of interactions
take
are
all the
over
anime
place
stuff and then
until
make
the
it
end
into
of
it.
Duelist Kingdom, and a lot of them are
needs to be
quite a bit more
dramatic.
extreme than this example. Something that consistently affects the way the game is played, and there are way too many examples of this for me to cite them all, is certain types and attributes seem to be strong or weak against certain other types and attributes, like in Pokemon. Some more examples of this sort of thing include the copies of Karibo produced by Multiply exploding whenever they come into contact with an attack or another monster, Mammoth Graveyard causing a monster's body to slowly deteriorate whenever it's fused with it, Harpy's pet dragon refusing to attack any of the Harpy ladies, and of course the two examples I mentioned earlier. Now like I said, this had to be changed when Duel Monsters was adapted into a real trading card game. In real life, it's not automated, so stuff like this just can't happen. I mean, I guess it's theoretically possible, but you would have to create this gigantic list of all of the different card interactions and relationships, and even with a small card pool, keeping track of all of them would be pretty difficult.
Be
but now that there are nearly 10,000 cards in the game, it would be a nightmare to handle something like that. Time Wizard is a great example of why this sort of thing can't work, and in Time Wizard's case, it is a bit different, because what I'm about to talk about is his actual effect, but it's an effect that in real life just cannot work the same way it does in the manga. Every time the effect is used, it does something completely different depending on the monster being affected, and then on top of that, it summons this giant roulette to determine whether or not the effect is successful, and unless the players were going to be expected to carry a replica of this thing around, which I imagine would probably need batteries, there was just no way to do a one-to-one translation of it into the real-life card game. So Dark Sage and Thousand Dragon had to be made into entirely different cards, and Time Wizard's effect had to be changed completely. In real life, the effect has the player flip a coin, and if they call it right, they get to blow up all their opponent's monsters, and if they call it wrong, they have to destroy all of their own. Nowhere near as good, but also not a ruling nightmare, so I definitely think this is preferable. Speaking of cards with different effects in the anime and manga than in real life, there are a lot of them, and this is the last thing that I want to talk about. Obviously, I won't go over all of them because there are way too many, but I will discuss the ones that I find the most interesting. The first card I want to talk about is the anime version of Virus Cannon. This card is so stupid. Its effect destroys every spell card in your opponent's hand and in their deck for free. There is no cost to activate it. There are no activation requirements, no setup necessary. All you have to do is draw it. And since we're talking about the anime, drawing through your entire deck until you get exactly the card you're looking for isn't hard to do at all. There are a lot of really powerful draw cards in the manga and the anime, like Card of Sanctity, for example. Now, in real life, this card is awful, and you should never, ever play it. But in the anime, it's really, really good. Card text is pretty simple. It just says both players draw until they have 6 cards in their hand. And the reason this is so good is because if you can somehow get every card out of your hand, let's say you summon a monster, maybe 2, and then set a bunch of spells and traps to your side of the field, when you activate this card, you will get to draw 6 cards, and your opponent will only get to draw 1. Another really powerful draw spell is Card of Demise, and this card is actually still pretty good in real life, despite the fact that it was nerfed into the ground. In real life, you can't special summon during the turn you activate this card, your opponent doesn't take any damage during the turn you activate this card, and you have to discard every card in your hand to the graveyard during the end phase. In the anime and manga, though, the card says draw until you have 5 cards in your hand, and then 5 turns later, discard your entire hand to the graveyard. Now, the thing is, if you run multiple copies of a card that allows you to potentially draw 5 cards, chances are your opponent probably isn't going to live for 5 turns, so a card like this, it could just never be printed in the real game. It would be way too strong. The last draw spell that I want to talk about is Card of Safe Return, and just like the other two, this card is nuts in the anime. In real life, it's actually so good that it's banned, and has been banned for 10 years, despite the fact that it's nowhere near as good as its anime counterpart. In real life, the card's a continuous spell that allows you to draw 1 card every time a monster is special summoned from your graveyard. In the anime and manga, though, the card lets you draw 3 cards every time a monster is special summoned from either graveyard. Now, if you don't have a lot of experience playing the actual game, then you might not understand exactly why these effects are so insane. So let me show you the sort of stuff that's possible with a deck full of cards like this.
My mate Steve plays this all the time. Damn, there you go.
Now, the deck in the replay you just saw was composed almost entirely of cards that appeared in or before Battle City. The only card I activated that hadn't been seen up to that point was Double Summon, but it didn't appear super late in Yu-Gi-Oh's chronology. It made its first appearance in Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. Anyway, I do also have a version of the deck that only uses cards available during Battle City, so let's go ahead and take a look at that to really prove my point.
Okay.
Of course, this was possible not just because of the crazy draw spells in the deck, but also because of Obelisk's anime effect. This brings me to the anime versions of the God cards, which are very, very different from their real-life counterparts. They're pretty much impossible to get rid of once they hit the field, since they have insane attack and defense values and are unaffected by all card effects, and all three of them have crazy secondary effects of their own. Now, when it came to printing legally playable versions of them, I don't think the issue was how powerful they'd end up being if they had their anime effects, but instead how difficult it would be to fit all of their anime effect text onto one card. Anyway, like I said earlier, there are tons of cards with different effects in the anime and mangas and in real life. Way too many for me to go over all of them here, and to be honest, I actually think that that would make a pretty good video topic of its own. To answer the question posed in the title, though, obviously these effect differences exist due to balancing issues, because cards like the anime version of Card of Sanctity and Card of Demise are way too good to exist in the real trading card game, and while usually only minor changes are made to a card's effect when it's adapted for play in the TCG and OCG, sometimes the changes can be more substantial and can have a pretty big impact on the game as a whole. Anyway, I think I've gone over everything I need to here. Like I said, if you guys want to see me do a follow-up video where I take a look at individual card differences present between the real game and the anime, I'd be more than happy to, but if you have another video idea in mind, then feel free to leave it in the comments below or shoot me a mention on Twitter.
Interesting. Very different, though. I like that he's doing other stuff, though. I can imagine people complaining because it's not what he usually does, but I still like that he's branching out and doing other stuff now. That was cool. Obviously, the rules, in my opinion, are different because the anime and the manga needs to be entertaining and a visual spectacle, and it needs to be exciting and that. But obviously, at the same time, I understand how he's gone and blocked the rules in the anime. Can't be like this in real life because, you know, real life situations and stuff within the game. That's cool. Interesting. I like it. So, yeah, thank you guys very much for watching. What do you guys think of that? What do you guys think of this? Click like, subscribe if you haven't already. Leave comments down below. Let me know what I should discuss in future videos. And I'll see you guys, yes, Yu-Gi-Oh guys, next time. Bye.